How are you
Hey, how
doing?
are you? Good, good.
Good.
Nice
I've
to
been
hear.
really looking forward to this chat with you today.
Yeah, ditto.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your role?
Yeah, so I'm Micah Clark. I'm a principal at Moonshot CVE, and I also am the director of product for Moonshot, which means a lot of different things. So I do a lot of sort of organizational leadership for the company, but also look after a lot of our technical development and
Nice.
all of the development oriented toward building analytical products that are sort of tech enabled. So that's a good fit for me. I'm really glad to have it because a lot of my background is in sort of helping to blend technology into analytical processes and teach people how to use tech tools, but also just data in general to make better decisions. So I've worked in sort of to one degree or another, kind of in open source intelligence since about 2013, and a little bit in think tanks and a little bit kind of in the defense world, doing some training and some program management there. So a little of everything, but my like long-term way back background is like in history and philosophy. So I actually have zero technical background. It's all kind of acquired largely through trial and error, and having the good fortune of working with a lot of smart people who've taught me a lot of things. Yeah, it's fun. It's a fun role, and at the intersection of a lot of technology development, which is concrete but also really challenging, and then a lot of really rich, colorful sort of subject matter background. Mainly around extremism these days, but also other things, bad things that happen on the internet, sort of like disinformation and even things like child sexual exploitation and other things like that occasionally we'll do work on. A lot of the methods and approaches that I've built over time and that we as a company use have pretty wide application in a lot of different online harms. So we've been sort of selectively and skillfully sort of poking and working in different directions, sort of vectoring away from just extremism to other areas as well.
Fantastic. So why does online intelligence interest you? It's what about it really kind of made it a good move for you to go into?
My particular interest in the online space and particularly around how people analyze online information is just that the internet it's a tricky space. Generally it's been built for us to experience, not to analyze. And so figuring out how to look at the internet as a source of information and insight as opposed to a source of just fun and a source of experiences and phenomenon is interesting, and getting analysts to be able to create the kind of analytical mindset to be able to do that in a disciplined, consistent way, make good use of time, avoid a lot of the analytical sort of landmines that often come up in general, but doing that in the context of using it in the online space is interesting. And I think the other thing too is that as tricky as it is, it's also incredibly powerful, right? So what is the internet? I think the best definition I've ever come up with is it's a facilitation machine. It just makes things easier. Good things, bad things, everything. It just makes things happen faster and easier. And so in the same way that, a lot of the stuff that we study and work on around extremism and that sort of stuff is facilitated by the internet, so too are solutions to those problems. And so a lot of what Moonshot's about is trying to figure out how to kind of balance that out and then take a much more optimistic view of what we can accomplish in that kind of context. There's a scholar of terrorism called Thomas Hegghammer, and many years ago he did a lecture, and I remember he was talking about how we have this we call the terrorism optimism bias, where we assume that terrorists necessarily have command of the internet because they're fast and they're quick and they're slick and stuff like that. And he said we need to start studying more, not just how they benefit from the internet, but also how they suffer from the internet. What are the opportunities that we can take to actually leverage some of the challenges that they have? And so, for Moonshot, but just sort of by way of introduction too, Moonshot's approach is to see people who are at risk of getting involved in extremism as potential beneficiaries and use the internet to try and support them to just get them away from that particular way of looking at the world and participation, rather than as targets. And I think, again, I've worked in different parts of the security world where people who are at risk or people who are getting involved in movements become securitized and they become bad people. And then when you say someone's a bad person or a terrorist, you can, depending who you are, you can do a lot of pretty bad things to them. And so Moonshot's very much focused in the other direction, which is to see that, appreciating that there are totally valid security concerns, and sometimes that's the case, but there's a lot of people who are on a continuum of involvement who could be steered away from doing that, and that the internet is an incredible source of communication and opportunity to reach out to those people.
Yeah, that's something that has really interested me about Moonshot as I learn more about the technology and the organization itself. I read an article recently in The Guardian that was describing, individual who had been, radicalized and kind of recruited for a terrorist group. And, now that person is actually in a support position, identifying, people on the internet who are at risk of experiencing what he had experienced. And so now not only has he come out of that situation, now he's in a position where he has enough information on both sides to be able to provide support. And that's something that, I really found interesting about Moonshot, is it's not just about, getting the bad guy. Like, there's so much more to it, and understanding from a human perspective that not everybody who gets into these situations is necessarily bad. A lot of them are, most people inherently are, just looking to fit in somewhere. And that's something that I've noticed in a lot of these extremist communities, is that their ways of thinking have been altered, right? And so it sounds like, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different theories for how people get involved in these movements, and what are the sort of drivers of radicalization, which is one of the kind of common ways of structuring it or describing it. And quest for belonging is definitely, or like a desire for belonging is definitely an important one. There's another guy, Lauren Dawson, who's a Canadian prof, talks about the quest for meaning. They're just seeking something that they're trying to make meaning in their life, and there's a lot to be said for that. So it's not surprising, and I think we all find meaning in different parts of our lives. Every person I meet finds meaning in a slightly different way, and belonging in a slightly different way. And so, as much as we use the internet and we use lots of fancy technology, really it comes down to a bunch of people, especially in the leadership team, a lot of people with a background in humanities. And a background in activism and social work, who recognize that there's a lot of different sort of dimensions to the human experience that lead people to get involved in extremist groups, and also equally lead people out of extremist groups as well. That's one of the most interesting things that I've gotten to learn more about more recently, is sort of demobilization and de-radicalization, and the things that draw people out of groups. And it's fascinating, like the role of family, the role of children, for example. A lot of people in the far right, and like the violent fringe of the far right in particular, once they have kids, suddenly they realize, I don't know if I really want to teach my kid how to hate. Like, that's just it just doesn't seem right. And if I don't want to teach that to my kid, why do I think those things? What's it going to take for me to change my way of being? That's not the case for everybody, but it's a pretty common narrative. And it's kind of neat because, again, Moonshot works with a lot of former extremists. One of the co-founders of Moonshot, Ross Frenette, in a previous role was the sort of manager of what's called the AVE network. It's the Against Violent Extremism Network, which is a big network of former extremists as well as victims of terrorism, who sort of work together to try and solve the world's problems, basically. And so there's a huge community of formers, and a lot of them see as part of their kind of process of sort of recovery, I guess, if you want to call it that, or sort of their process of making things right. They're quite active in the sort of anti-extremism and anti-radicalization space as a consequence. So we see them as allies, potential allies in the fight.
Moonshot recently published a really great resource, which is targeted for social services practitioners. And I just wanted to read a quote in it that I found really interesting. It says, "We hope to empower practitioners to accurately identify individuals who are involved with the incel community, understand their unique frames of reference, and engage with them in an informed, skillful way." Now, this is a resource that describes incel terminology and ways of thinking to help, the average person as well as a social practitioner to be able to support people in the incel community. And I would just really appreciate the framework of Moonshot as a company who aims to understand and support those in more niche outsider communities. So we're using OSINT tools to identify these, but then also using people who are in a support role to, as we said, kind of redirect their thinking or understand their thinking, and hope to get, people outside of these communities. Can you share with me a little bit more about the process of how that all works?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in that quote that you mentioned, I think that the key word there is skillful too, which we underplay a lot of the time. I think, again, the internet's full of, cat memes and silly things like that. And so we have a tendency to think that the work that goes along with it can lack a lot of that discipline and skill. So I'm a big fan of being skillful about things. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to think about that, right? Like even Buddhism talks about skillfulness in terms of how we think and stuff like this. So I think that's the critical thing in that quote too, is that if you want to engage with these individuals, you need to do so carefully and smartly and empathetically. And doing it empathetically means you need to be really skilled about how you're thinking about things and how you're engaging, how you're communicating with people, and how you're listening to people. The incel community is a really unique case. I worked on a lot of different types of extremism and sort of AQ and ISIS extremism and far right stuff and white supremacist stuff and Buddhist extremism and all kinds of stuff. I will tell you that the number of people who've looked at incel sort of rhetoric and ideology, particularly as it gets more violent, and have just worked in these other extremism worlds for a long time, and they're just completely shook by incels. It's very bewildering. And I think part of it is that there's the relatability of it. Like it's basically founded in a sort of like loneliness, a certain self-loathing, that it's a very human experience. It's easy to make fun of as well, but that only makes things worse. So for us, we see it as both, incels as both a public safety threat potentially for people who, want to commit acts of violence. Suicide by cop is not an uncommon sort of approach for the incel community. Equally though, a public health crisis there too, because a lot of incels are very focused on the physical self-loathing. They literally hate themselves physically because they see themselves as genetically predetermined not to be lovable. And so suicide and self-harm is an incredible risk in that community. So for us, the important thing about that incel project that we're running is it's not exclusively an online project. We see the online world as a sort of data source for a much more complete picture of that movement. So when we're trying to help inform practitioners, it's not just about how to help find them on the internet. In fact, I would probably say that it's pretty unlikely that that's really the focus of anything. It's really more when you have people in a clinical setting or something like that, or a social service setting, who are presenting with or exhibiting some of these things or using terminology or what have you, that you can say, okay, this is this kind of sphere that I'm aware of, and I can engage with it in a skillful way, I guess. The Alec Manassian testimony, or not his testimony, his interrogation, the interview, the record of that is really something. And you can, at a certain point, the inspector who's sitting there for hours and hours and hours, then he finally starts to get into the reasoning for why Alec Manassian got in a van and tried to drive over a bunch of people. Manassian's basically explaining what incel ideology looks like and his reasons for it. And the guy can't help but chuckle. Like he's almost so bewildered by it, and he sees it as so odd that he actually starts laughing. Right? It's kind of crazy. But again, it's very relatable. Like it's such an odd little corner of the world that you have to help people understand that, so that obviously you couldn't have expected this inspector probably to know a whole lot about it at that point. But I think that the reality is that this particular area of, not necessarily just extremism, but this particular issue is going to come up over and over again in the future. So that's our hope, is just to provide people with resources and an understanding of the scope of the problem, and also appreciate that it's not super scary, right? In some ways, it's very reasonable. It's a reasonable way to engage with them. When the report came out, we even had sort of folks who are involved in the incel community dialoguing with us online, and talking about, well, I'm not sure what I think about that particular approach to it, or hey, I have these considerations, and these are the reasons that I'm an incel, and kind of, just talking to us about what that means and what that means for them, and making sure that it's not overinterpreted. There's been a lot of movement in Canada recently around incels that happened to coincide with a lot of the work that we're doing, listing an individual who committed a murder, adding terrorism charges based on incel ideology to his charges, and the RCMP's adding some references to incels to their terrorism and violent extremism sort of guide and things like this. So it's a moment where people are starting to really dig into that, and we want to make sure that we can do that in a reasonable way. Yeah, and not just make it seem as though every incel is a terrorist, because they're really not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we wrap up, I did want to ask you, because I've heard that you have quite the green thumb, and I'm currently growing my first balcony garden here in Victoria, trying to grow some veggies. So do you have any pro tips for me?
Well, I mean, the one that comes up a lot, it's kind of funny, because it relates back to my work, and to like analytical tradecraft, is that people often don't realize that with tomatoes, especially with indeterminate tomatoes like vine tomatoes, there's a sort of pruning that you're supposed to do to make sure they're really healthy and that you get the best product. And that actually relates back to sort of like analytical tradecraft as well. And it's when a tomato plant kind of goes up like this, there's a main stem, and then off the stem usually there's like leaves, right? Like leaf fronds. But in the middle there will often be this funny little thing. It's called a sucker, and it kind of like it pops up in the almost like the armpit of the tomato, and it just looks like a little tomato plant, because it is a little tomato plant. If you don't nip those out, and you don't have to, but if you don't take those out, they basically become a whole new tomato plant. So instead of just being like one more branch, they'll actually turn into a whole new growth head and a whole new set of branches. So there's this exponential growth that can happen. The crazy thing, depending on the type of tomato, is that you can get a sucker on every single joint all the way up the tomato. So you could have, 30 or 40 suckers coming off of a single tomato plant. And if you're not managing that carefully, and kind of making sure that you're being, again, skillful about that, you can have a real problem on your hands, because the plant will just fall over, or it'll just get just completely unsustainable. And so as it relates to intelligence, I often talk about that in terms of collection development, and looking at the results that you get from a particular search query, and looking at the opportunities to kind of prune the suckers in that search query, because often you'll have the core concept you're looking for, depending on how specific it is, and then there will be maybe 4 or 5 different related sort of areas, right? You go get into the data and you find, oh, okay, well, there's this conversation happening about that, this one. Really, you need to kind of prune the suckers and say, well, these 3, interesting, I'm sure they would be fun to look at, but right now I've got to focus on just these 2, just get rid of the other ones, because the nature of analytical work and the nature of research work is you just keep going and going and going, and those suckers turn into a whole new plant. And so you have to just show a lot of discipline around what you actually pursue. So I've used that actually in training classes before, and half the time people are like, oh, that's an interesting pointer for analytical work. And the other half of the time people are like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Like that's what's wrong with my tomato plants. So as long as people get something out of it, I'm okay with it. But I've got, I don't know, probably 20 tomatoes in the backyard at the moment. So
wow.
I gotta sucker those pretty regularly, just about every day, every couple of days. So.
Fantastic. I love that you tied that into intelligence research, because not only do I have that same problem with my tomato plants, I also find myself getting into these wormholes when I'm doing my own research. So thank you so much for that. That was a great tip. That was a dual tip.
It's poignant, and I guess that I like when different parts of my world collide like that. But I think that's probably the biggest analytical habit, really, that people have to show, is a lot of discipline around what they actually pursue. And different tools help you do that better. But it really comes down to showing a lot of discipline, a lot of focus. So.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Micah, for meeting with me today. I really enjoyed our chat and learning more about what you do and what Moonshot does. And it's really great to hear some insight from, you know, somebody who's actually in there doing the work, and hear your perspective on, you know, the type of kind of investigative searches that you're doing, and the, you know, the very human perspective that comes from Moonshot as an organization. I just find it so fascinating, and really value your opinion.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun.